Welcome to The Adaptive Mind, where we talk with experts about practical, effective approaches to breaking habits and changing behavior. I'm your host, Brady Dowling. I'm glad you're listening. The Adaptive Mind is presented by Nurture, the #1 research-based app to help you break habits using self-compassion and science-backed methods. Find the link to install Nurture on iPhone or Android in the show notes. Welcome to this episode of The Adaptive Mind. Today we are joined by Anthony Abagnano, and he's the author of Outer Chaos, Inner Calm, which is a guide for anyone seeking real grounded change, from breaking addictive habits to finding true resilience in everyday life. Welcome, Anthony, and thanks so much for joining.
Hey, thanks, Brady. It's good to be with you.
So to jump in, your own story begins with like outward success, but then a growing sense of inner emptiness. For people who might feel stuck or dissatisfied, sometimes maybe before they even know why, what were some of your first signals that you needed a change?
What a great question. Well, I think I never fit in, actually, and so it started from as far back as I can remember. I always kind of felt like the outsider, and I then began to question some of the things I was being encouraged to do in order to fit in, and they just didn't seem right, like lying. I was being encouraged to lie as a child in order to comply. And I remember my mum and dad, I mean, I must have been 4 or 5 years old, and my mum and dad were talking about the dinner they didn't want to go to, and they were inventing reasons they could give that they wouldn't be able to go to dinner. And I think it was something about me like, oh no, Anthony's not well. And I'm sitting here going, what do you mean I'm not well? I'm fine. And so there was definitely something discordant even from a young age like that. And I had a very powerful spiritual experience when I was about 8 years old. And that then kind of put a marker on my life map that I couldn't help but measure against as I grew older. And even though I was very successful materially and in the outer world, I was inside, there was something drying up like a sponge that was dry and curling. And I knew, and with that juxtaposition from what I'd experienced as an 8-year-old and then living such a life that was kind of contrary, it's like I had one foot in each of these two realities, something that was beyond what I'd call our normal experience, and then being very functional and excellent in the material, dense world that we live in. And it kind of felt like these things, how can I possibly bring them into the same space? It's like I'm doing the splits, trying to keep a foot in one and a foot in the other. And it just became untenable in my 40s. It just became like, there's no way I can live like this. I'm not happy. I'm not in a good relationship. I'm trying to find the right one, and she's always avoiding me somehow, and things just were not clicking, even though I had wonderful collection of classic cars and all the kind of accoutrement that money could buy. I was inside a pretty dry soul and unfulfilled.
And so it sounds like there was kind of like this buildup, maybe several key instances or markers throughout your life where you were like, this is not really aligning with kind of what fits inside me. Was there kind of like a catalyst as well at the end, quote unquote, that kind of made you like the straw that broke the camel's back?
Well, I was definitely aided by illness. Yeah, I had a life-threatening illness. I actually contracted parasites and nobody could find them. It didn't look like I had them, but I was definitely wasting away and reduced to not a vegetable. I could think, but I couldn't move for several weeks, and we thought I was on the exit ramp. But fortunately, my now wife, who is an intuitive, named exactly what the problem was, and I got in a wheelchair and got to New York, and the doctor helped me and found out what it was. So that was it was a great gift. It was what I call the great illness, and I think many of us have those in our lives, but it was also the great gift. And I wanna I tongue in cheek here, I want to speak of addiction as being a gift too, because what it takes for us to become a master of our addictions is extraordinary, and they're the strongest people I know. The most resilient people I know are the people that have met that underlying need underneath the addiction themselves, rather than allowing it to be met from outside, either by people or substance, and or coping systems. And that's very much what I work with, is people who are in those kinds of situations, and I'm in constant admiration of um, of how people are able to step into mastery with those things.
Yeah, great. That's a great segue. So jumping into that kind of line of thought, um, oftentimes breath work is used as a means of relaxation or, coping with stress. For someone caught in kind of a cycle or a loop of habits or craving or compulsive behaviors, what's a practical way to use the breath in these moments?
There are a number of ways it can be used. One way would be to cope right now with this discomfort that I'm experiencing. And another one is to build the resilience and the robustness that I need to be able to not just witness the situation and the feeling that I'm having, and but to be able to actually distance myself from it in a healthy way, not in a reactive way. In other words, perhaps transferring the addiction from one thing to another, to something that's maybe a little less damaging, like being a gym addict as opposed to a alcohol addict, but actually resolution, something that's actually individuated and independent from the experience of addiction. So, and one of the principles about breath work is that it's best to practice it when you don't need it. So when you do need it, it's the tool you can find in your box. So there's a bit of a paradox there in terms of using the breath. But the most functional breath that I've experienced with addiction is a conscious connected breath, which is really the big kahuna of breath work. It's not just being conscious of the fact that you're breathing, it's also connecting each breath to the last, as if it was a violin solo that never stopped, like the music is continually flowing, just like your breath is continually flowing. So that lack of hesitation between the inhale and the exhale physiologically is doing things that help us think differently. It's slowing down the motors of the frontal lobe, the prefrontal cortex. And so we think a little bit more slowly and a little bit more disjointedly. But it's also doing things that are metaphysical and even non-physical as well, that are informing our state of presence and our state of mind. And when I say that, um, I think in a way I need to rewind to what one breath is, and then understand, if we give our attention to breath, there's a huge shift that occurs. For example, if I ask you to pay attention to your breath now, it will change. You can't leave it the way it was before you started to notice it. And that's just the beginning. That's just the headline. Underneath that is the whole body of the data and structural shifts that are occurring, because once you give your attention to your breath, you are using your choice. And addiction is a pretty choiceless state. It might feel like we're making choices, but it's often a trauma reaction, and a state in which we have foregone our choices or forsaken them. So just the act of giving your attention to your breath is a choice. And I think one of the things that's sadly lacking in the world of personal transformation and self-development, addiction or otherwise, is the failure to acknowledge ourselves for what we've already done. So even if you're sitting here right now listening, you have made choices to be here. But unless you recognize, if you are of the mindset that, yeah, well, I was on the internet and this came up and I watched it, that's one way of looking at the experience. The other way of looking at the experience is actually I protected the time so I could really pay attention to something that might be different. And I've done something. I've done something constructive for myself. And I'm going to feel differently with either one of those two alternatives. In one sense, I'm going to feel beaten and the victim of my experience. In the other sense, I've got one foot on the ladder. Now it's a question of where does that ladder lead to and how many rungs are there in order for me to exit this mindset that I've inhabited in the past. So acknowledgement is fundamental. Noticing that you're breathing is fundamental. And I think understanding that, you know, I mean, I've taken just about every drug, every form of alcohol, other than needle drugs I haven't taken, but I probably could have been categorized as I am an addictive personality. I've fortunately found the one harmless addiction that I can, which is the breath. So I get away with it now, and it's one that I can transfer all my addictive tendencies to. But I think if I said I wanted to draw attention to one breath, because it starts with one breath. It starts with the choice to make one breath and having some grasp of how significant one breath actually is. So just consider the first breath of your life. You inhaled everything. You inhaled existence in all its totality, with all its opposites, with all its delights, with all its threats, with all everything. You inhaled unconditionally in that first in breath. And you did physiological things like you had liquid in your lungs that you got rid of as you breathed. You activated different systems in your body as a result of your breath. Your whole body became alive because of this life force replacing the life force that you had before, which was through the umbilical cord. So the moment that umbilical cord is cut, you become autonomous. You have created autonomy by virtue of using your own breath. Now that's significant. And if you just take one breath and reflect on, God, could I remember what that would have been like? Or can I imagine what that would have been like, that experience as my first conscious experience of being on this planet, is pretty darn immense, right? And that's why there was a whole what they called a rebirthing movement with breathwork that began in the late 60s, early 70s of the last century, because this concept of when I breathe in, it's an emulation, it's a repetition of the first breath that I ever took. And what could that signify? What could it signify realistically? And what else can be awakened in my awareness or in my body? And what is awakened continually every time that I breathe in? And then what could it symbolize? What could it symbolize in terms of my grasp of life, my openness to life, my sense of trust with life? A whole range of psycho-emotional awarenesses that we could inquire into. And we've just dealt with half a breath right now. We've just dealt with one inhale. And then when you exhale, everything goes, right? And let's imagine that we're going to have our last breath. What would that be like? What will you have to let go of with that last exhale? All the wealth, all the accomplishments, all the failures, all the wounds, all the loves, all everything is going to be released with that last breath. And it's funny, I chat GPT'd this a few weeks ago, and I said, what happens when you have your last breath? And it says consciousness ends, which I found to be a very limited chat GPT view of what consciousness is. But
Yeah.
so it made me chuckle. But definitely there are a lot of things that are finishing with that last breath. And if we call that first breath a rebirth, then maybe we can consider that last breath a pre-death. And we're doing this 25,000 times a day. And how many of those 25,000 are you actually aware of? Now, that suggests that there's something going on that we're not paying attention to. And so then when I say paying attention to your breath changes everything, it makes more sense because there are 25,000 opportunities every day to be present with what's actually happening, the entering of life force into my body and the exhaustion of life force out of my body. And I don't pay attention to it at all unless I haven't got enough. Then I pay attention. I go, I see something absolutely stunningly awe-inspiring that takes my breath away, like we use the cliche. Then I kind of pay momentary attention. So that's why just the act of paying your attention to your breath is a huge act that very few people do. You are gaining access to an archive of hard physical data that no one looks at or experiences. If you're taking any kind of drug to change your awareness, I don't know of any, and I've taken all the plant medicine or done the whole works. I don't know any that works like that. In one breath, that I can open my awareness to an alternative reality is extraordinary to me. And I'm willing to try other things if anybody's got ideas, but that's really where that's been my destination for the last 40 years, 50 years. Then you consider the power of connecting each breath and choosing each breath in a row, and then some really profound things happen. First of all, considering most of us are addictive because of trauma, and considering trauma is one of the few ways that we can impact the subconscious and program the subconscious mind, an alternative way to reprogram the subconscious mind, and let's just assume, let's hypothesize that something in our unconscious mind is creating the addiction within which we live. A way to reprogram the subconscious mind is with repetition. There are 3 or 4 different ways. One is impact or trauma, one is repetition, one is being subjugated to authority. So if you were kidnapped, for example, the Stockholm syndrome, or if you were in a restrictive governmental regime like some unfortunate people are right now, things like that can inform and reprogram your subconscious. On the positive side, repetition can reprogram your subconscious. And if you're choosing to remember that you're breathing with each breath, you are now stacking your consciousness. You're actually stacking your awareness. You're building it like building blocks, and you are repeating it every time you choose to do it. So you are now opening the door to an archive that really remains closed and has made you a slave in the past of operating systems that were developed at a young age that have never been upgraded or updated. So you're now moving into the role of becoming your own hero, your own rescuer, and your own solution rather than looking for anything outside you at all. And I know, for example, in the 12 steps programs, we hand a lot to God, right? We hand a lot to what we'll call God power. And I want to be more inclusive to that than that, in the sense that let's call it the God of your understanding, any power that you would consider to be bigger than your own processing power. Well, the breath, of course, we call it getting inspired, right? And getting inspired, what does that, what does the Latin say about getting inspired? That means we bring in spirit, we're importing spirit. I don't know of any other way that I can get such a direct contact with spiritual force and supernatural power than with the breath. There's nobody interpreting it. There's nobody. It's direct connection. This is getting high on my own supply. This has nothing to do with a priest or an imam or a rabbi or anybody who's telling me what to believe. This is written about in every major religious document repeatedly as a supernatural force. So here am I, in whatever state of being that I'm in, no matter how grim or miserable. If I make a choice to breathe consciously, I'm changing things right away. If I make a choice to breathe consciously and in a connected way and repetitively, I'm now stacking the opportunities and the choices rather than the disasters and the depressive elements of life that I live. And so the more I do it, the better I become. The more beefy, the more resilient, the more powerful, the more empowered I become. And of course, then there are more subtle elements that come later on, but which are, outweigh what I've just discussed by a
Yeah.
multiple of times. But this is a journey that if you're willing to make that first step with one breath, that can change your entire life.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, great. So I love how you talked about really how we're so commonly thinking of breath as a coping mechanism or a coping skill to use in the moment, like almost like a band-aid or something that's immediately impactful. But really, like the more expansive and more impactful way to use the breath is to kind of stack breath upon breath upon breath, almost as like a daily vitamin that should be used and like increasing that skill and building upon that. And you also talked about mindset, like, um, and so taking that mindset thought, one of the biggest challenges I think that people face in breaking habits or addiction is self blame. And you emphasize that compassion instead of judgment is where real change starts. So, can you talk about begin, how to begin practicing self compassion, especially for someone who might be in the middle of a setback or feeling down on themselves?
Yeah, I just want to take a breath into feeling that because we've all experienced it, right? We all experience the inner critic, and my goodness, she or he can be harsh and it's devastating. It's overwhelming. It feels like all the forces of nature and beyond have conspired to weigh upon us, and there's very little resource there to be able to make a change. So there are so many different ways to approach this issue, which is very real and very serious. And as I said, one of them is to be prepared to make that choice to breathe. Another is the act of self acknowledgement. What can you acknowledge yourself for? I had someone I was speaking to this week who's been um, in suicide ideation, and I couldn't see her right away. I could only see her in a couple of days after she sent me this urgent message. So I said, look, I would like to ask you to do a bit of homework before we meet. What are the things that you can actually acknowledge yourself for having, now you've reached out to me, what are the things that you can actually acknowledge yourself for? And write them down. And then what would celebration look like for those things that you can acknowledge yourself for? And be realistic, don't be fake about it, but you need to go through this exercise. And then the day before I met her, she said, I just want to say that's changed everything. My perspective has now
Wow.
shifted. So I think, and happens all the time. I mean, this isn't a one-off for me. This happens repeatedly. I've understood that the ability to find something to acknowledge and then to find some little celebration, a few breaths or an ice cream or, preferably not the thing that you're addicted to, then that really help solidify and cement in the subconscious that something is beginning to change. There's a possibility of something shifting. And then another way of looking at this is that we are built of parts. And Dick Schwartz has done a lot of work with something called internal family systems, which is great work. And it underlines the fact that when we're traumatized, there's a fragmentation that occurs. So if the trauma is the origin of our addiction, and we want to go back to origin in order to let the addiction be resolved rather than beaten or sidelined or marginalized, but actually resolved. And the word solved is in there, not relief. That's the difference between relief and resolution. If we go back to source and we go back to the trauma, what actually happens when we get traumatized? Well, one very significant thing is we lose our breath. And in the act of losing our breath, we shut down our consciousness, like ChatGPT says, but we also embody and embed the shock that the trauma caused. It actually belongs in our body. It actually rests in our cellular structure physiologically. And as we roll on from that point, the last thing we want to do is revisit that memory, right? We find ways of hiding from it and coping with it. And often those become addictive. They become our coping system that we rely upon, that we then can't live without. And that can then be the foundation of our addiction. But the big issue when we seek to isolate ourselves from the cause of the trauma is that we inadvertently also detach from the part of ourselves that got hurt by the trauma. And so that part gets excommunicated from our wholeness. We just like, no, don't want to go there. I don't want to remember that event. That was so darn horrid. I blocked that. And we inadvertently throw out the baby with the bathwater. We throw out that part of who we once were because it's too painful to remember the trauma itself. And a lot of the work I do and a process that I've developed called the bridge, which is something that I visit in the book, is about reclaiming those parts that we've left behind. It's about building a bridge. So those parts of who we are that we have forgotten are no longer left behind, that they can be included in the show. And if we don't do that, you can imagine, I mean, how many times are we traumatized as a child? I mean, like how many times in a day were we traumatized, a TV program or watching our parents argue or, so many different things that left deep imprints in our subconscious, let alone the abuses and the seeing trauma for other people and collective trauma, generational trauma, cultural trauma, ancestral trauma, all the things that we've inherited that we had nothing to do with, but still weigh upon us. So think of how many fragments there are that have been kicked out of our awareness in order to survive. It's an immense part of who we are. And I think to me, it explains why when we look at for example, the geopolitical stage where we see our world leaders in debate and they're talking like 10-year-olds, there's no maturity there. They're arguing like they're scrapping in a playground. And these are the people with their finger over the button. It's like, oh my God, what is actually going on in this world? So how do we get to grips? How can we possibly begin to reverse this very dire situation that the world is in? Well, we need to begin with us. And that means by reclaiming parts of ourselves that we have left isolated in the past. And when we have that wholeness and we become the actor, the hero of our own journey, then we don't need to look outside for the solution. Then we become more resourceful. We become the source of our own safety, of our own connection. We don't need to export these things to other people or habits, practices, or substances in order to feel complete. We have a completeness that is, and we don't need a coping system that might find relief but not provide resolution. And the good news about the work with the bridge is that we don't actually need to remember the trauma at all. We don't have to revisit the trauma. In fact, with trauma, what we've discovered in the last 10 or 15 years is that the old days of like standing in front of it and getting stronger, we're going to have you remember what happened to you in the First World War, remember the bomb that went off and be stronger, we found is the opposite of what needs to happen. Every time that the trauma gets reawakened or even suggested, all the same hormones in the body are rushing around. The norepinephrine, the cortisol, the adrenaline are all surging through the body in an effort to protect us. They're what give us the strength to lift the car off our child. That's what those chemicals and hormones are meant for. But in today's world, we live at 70% capacity of that hormonal presence as a baseline. Before it used to be 10 or 20%, but now we're pretty much like ready for the next hit, right? I mean, if you go up to someone on the subway during rush hour and you go, boo, they're going to be shocked. But if someone was in a state of presence and you go up to them and you go, boo, they'll probably go, boo, because they're not threatened. But we live in an environment where we are resonating with threat. And we have what's called a reticular activation system, which is a gland in our head, the size of our little finger, that is a filtration system and controls what we notice in the world, because there's so much stimulus that we need to be selective. An example of your reticular activation system or your RAS system is that if you are hankering to buy a pink Chevrolet, you're going to suddenly start recognizing all the pink Chevrolets that are out there. You're going, oh God, there's someone else oh, look, there's another one out there. That's what the reticular activation system does. It tunes itself to where your consciousness or your subconsciousness wants to go. And we have control over this. We can actually make conscious choices as to what we notice or what we don't notice. So by bringing these parts back into wholeness, and I see this every day in my work, I see people who are more complete, more resourceful, more whole, and more able to make choices that command their lives. And the symptoms that I see people suffer from when they don't do this work are overwhelm, blaming the outer world for my condition, especially parents, lovers, relationships. You know, we have such a long list of all the things they did, right? Such a long list of all the reasons that we're going to stay in the situation that we're in. We can justify it and listen to those narratives day and night for our entire lives if we're not careful. But the moment we become causative in the outcomes that we experience is the moment that we create agency. And so no matter what condition you're in, if you're in a relapse, I know it feels like your whole world is overwhelming. I know what that feels like. We've all been there to some degree or another. But please know that there is a part of you that's feeling that overwhelm, not all of you. It's a part of you. And if you ask yourself, what part of me is it that is feeling so hopeless? You can find an answer to that question. And it's probably someone who was very young in your past that got abused or wounded or hurt or in an accident or something and has been left festering behind that memory that you have tried to ignore for your entire life. And if you simply go back and rescue that person, you will feel better and you will feel stronger and you will have your agency again. And that's why, you know, I heard someone make a snide remark about self-development work the other day. And I just, my wife told me about it. I said, well, God, why? I mean, if we don't do self-development, that means we let someone else do the development for us. I don't want anybody to do it for me. I want to
Yeah.
do it myself. So I think the way to that compassion that you asked about is by imagining yourself as a little one. The first time you got the damage that made you behave a certain way, look at that little one, experience that little one, notice what you feel in your body as I'm saying this right now, and know that that physical location in your body is where you've had this feeling your entire life, and make contact with that little one. Let that little one be rescued by you. What is it going to take for you to make the commitment to that? How can you not feel compassion for that little part of you that was abused or broken or wounded? If you saw a broken child in the street or a broken animal in the street, you feel something. You at least you want to feel something, even if you're so isolated or insulated. There's something inside that wants to be felt. Take a few breaths and open up to that body sensation. Open up to how you imagine the experience of that little child is or was for you, and then that's where your compassion begins.
Great. Um, okay, that's beautiful. So to close it out, you frame this work as a kind of hero's journey. Um, why is it so important for people, especially those breaking tough patterns, to see themselves as the hero of their own story? And also, what's one first step that someone that's listening could take today?
Well, I think the whole principle of the book is to pick up the pen and write your own book. That's really what it's intended to do, is to inspire people to definitely look at their past and look at the things that restricted them in their lives or restricted you in your life, and then to rewrite the things you want to rewrite with your current consciousness, because we're mostly dictated by operating systems that were developed in our first 7 years of life. So the invitation is to pick up the pen and write your own book rather than let someone else write it for you. It's kind of simple. It's a bit like, do you want to be stuck in the back of the taxi with a crazy taxi driver? Or do you want to climb in the front seat and drive down the roads you want to go down? And so that's why it's worth being the hero of your own story. I think the other reason is because if you're not the hero of your own story, life is grim and it's full of things like self judgment. I was talking about the parts earlier on. There's a part of us that is a judge and we hate it. I can't get rid of my inner critic. I can't but what would it take to actually love that judge? Because that judge has a lot of good qualities too. It's the one that makes you cross the street at the right time. It's the one that when you meet someone and you get a bad vibe from them says, nah, I'm going to go the other way. I'm going to stay clear of this. It's the one that attracts you to people too. So, love it and be in relationship with it. Don't force it into exile, include it in your life, and you'll find that maybe it doesn't need to be so darn harsh anymore. Another reason we need to be the hero of our own story, and I really say this from the bottom of my heart right now, is that if we don't do this as individuals, the existence of this world is not going to stay for as long as we'd like it to. We already know, and this is a very beautiful thing too, we already know that with AI, the acceleration is now exponentially exponential. It's no longer exponential, it's exponentially exponential. Exponential by itself, times itself. There's no way we can catch up with this. And so there's going to be an aftermath of this trajectory that we're on. I think it's a really fascinating opportunity. How would you like to be in a role of leadership in a new world that's going to exist? If you are an addict right now, you are being trained to be one of the strongest people on the planet. If you can step out of your addiction, nobody has had a training like yours about resilience and strength and leadership. It, it gives me goosebumps to think of the opportunity that is there in front of you. And of course, the paradox is that we don't see it. Of course, that's the paradox because life is paradox. And the older we get, the more we understand that that's the game. That's the divine joke, is that it's paradox. So no matter how desperate you feel, having agency in your life means that you can be an agent for change in your own life. And the outer chaos that's there need not affect you anymore. But not just that, you become a resplendent example of a winner, of inner calm. And no one is as qualified as you are if you're an addict now. No one is as qualified as you are to demonstrate the qualities of leadership that will need to be seen post this, whatever you want to call it, that's
Yeah.
going on. I was listening to a guy talk, Geordie is his name. He was one of the founders of the Ura Ring, one of the first investors in the Ura Ring. And I was
Hmm.
listening to him talk at the Sages and Scientists conference that I went to as a panelist in Mallorca last year, which was sponsored by the Chopra Foundation. And he said something very illuminating to me. It immediately landed in me. And it was that we've been through the industrial age. We're now in the technological age, and it's accelerating to the point of its own finiteness. Cannot, knowledge has no value anymore already. What's become more valuable than the information is the question that you asked, the prompt that you give. This is a significant shift that's occurring in the world. And the result of this by the end of this decade, if not before, is that we will enter into a spiritual age because we have exhausted everything else. There's nothing else left in the material plane to explore. We've done it. We've done the whole thing and we're killing each other. So something, if nature is right, will be born out of the compost of our human experience today. And you can be an actor, a principal actor. If you're the hero, you can be a principal actor of that transformation now and afterwards, a leader of a new generation.
Excellent. Well said. Thank you so much. Um, for anyone that wants to hear more from you, where can people find you? Where can people find your book?
The book's on Amazon. Just happen to have one right here. And it's very affordable on Kindle right now. And if you do buy a copy, by the way, if you buy the hardback or the paperback copy, we'll give you a free breathwork, a one-to-one breathwork from one of our trained facilitators, and that's worth like a couple of $100. So it's a good buy for $25 that you get a breathwork, and you can try this out for yourself. And also, you can join us every Sunday. If you're US based, it's 5 p.m. UK time, so work that out, or 9:30 a.m. UK time if you're Europe based. And we do Breathe the World, is what it's called, where we get the whole world breathing. In the morning, we have from Europe to Australia, and in the afternoon, we have from Europe to Hawaii. And there are several hundred people that come together and breathe live online. You can do it in your own home with headphones, and it is a conscious, connected breath. And get ready to blow your mind.
Awesome. Wow, that sounds really cool. Well, thank you so much, Anthony. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I think listeners will really enjoy it as well.
God bless you. Thanks for giving me a chance to reach more people. And thank you, each one of you, for your attention and your presence.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Adaptive Mind, brought to you by Nurture, the research-based app for overcoming unwanted or addictive behaviors. I hope you found our conversation insightful and inspiring. If you did, please subscribe, rate, and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. Your feedback helps us reach more listeners and continue bringing these learnings to people that need them. Remember that you have an adaptive mind that does incredible things every day, and it's capable of even more. We'll see you in the next episode.